So, this is part 4 of my assessment of the claims made by the popular Muslim apologist Mohammed Hijab about the treatment of non Muslims, particularly Jews, under Islamic law. I highly recommend you watch the first 3 parts, which are linked to in the description before this one, to better understand the context of this discussion. Here, I'll be discussing the topic of Jizyah. In this section, Hijab is claiming that it is not the case that Jizyah is a higher tax than Zakat, which is the tax that Muslims are obligated to pay. Hijab also states that in most cases, the Jizyah is less than what Muslims would have to pay in Zakat.
Turn pays taxes to the Islamic State. Some people say, well, actually, the taxes are discriminatory taxes because Al-Jizyah is a discriminatory tax. Well, discriminatory in what sense exactly? They'll say, well, maybe in their minds they think it's a higher tax. I've looked at the books of fiqh. I have not seen that that is the case. In fact, there's
higher than what you didn't mention. The
zakat. So obviously,
yes.
the comparative here would be zakat for the Muslims, right?
Yes.
But there is no evidence to show that a dhimmi would have to pay more taxes than a Muslim. So in what sense then is it discriminatory? You could say it's theological discrimination because it has a different name. Well, it has a different name because the word zakat itself in the Arabic language comes from a root which indicates purification, because it's an act of worship. Okay, so a dhimmi now who's paying jizya, he's not paying something which we consider to be an act of worship. He's paying taxes. It's an economic thing. And that's something we do in the West. For example, we are Muslims, we pay taxes in the West. So what really is problematic about the fact that you have non-Muslims in a Muslim land that have to pay some sort of taxes, and in fact, in many cases, if not, I would argue most cases, that would be less than the zakat or the sadaqah that would be paid by the Muslims.
So Hijab, who doesn't quote any sources here either, fails to mention that while zakat is not due on poor Muslims, most scholars of Islam did not include such an exemption for jizya on poor non-Muslims. Here's the breakdown of the ranges of jizya given by Imam Mawardi in his Ahkam as-Sultaniyyah. The Ahkam, if you're not familiar, is both the single most comprehensive account of the working of Islamic governance and equally a highly influential theoretical outline of the nature of that governance, according to Muslim booksellers themselves. Imam Mawardi states, the fuqaha, who are the legal scholars of Islam, differ as to the amount of the jizya. Abu Hanifa, who was the founder of the largest Sunni denomination present today, considers that those subjects to this tax are of 3 kinds. The rich, from whom 48 dirhams are taken, those of average means, from whom 24 dirhams are taken, and the poor, from whom 12 dirhams are taken. He thus stipulates the minimum and maximum amounts and prohibits any further judgment on behalf of those responsible for its collection. So here we see that even the poor are obligated to pay the jizya, which makes it worse than zakat, since zakat is not obligatory on poor Muslims. More on this in a bit, but continuing. Malik, who's the founder of the Maliki school of Islamic law, however, does not fix its minimum and maximum amount and considers that those responsible should make their own judgment as to the minimum and maximum. Ash-Shafi'i, founder of the Shafi'i school of Islamic law, considers that the minimum is a dinar and that it is not permissible to go below this, while he does not stipulate the maximum, the latter being dependent on the legal reasoning of those responsible. The Imam, however, should try to harmonize between the different amounts or to exact an amount in accordance with people's means. So even here, there is a minimum amount taken, even from poor non-Muslims, and Shafi does not permit changing them below that amount. And while Malik leaves it to the authorities to determine the minimum amount, even he doesn't declare that it should be 0 for poor non-Muslims, which it should be for it to be comparable to zakat. Now, Hijab argues that this tax on non-Muslims is not discriminatory.
But there is no evidence to show that a dhimmi would have to pay more taxes than a Muslim. So in what sense then is it discriminatory?
But as I've shown already, the minimum amount for zakat is 0, which is applied on poor Muslims. But the majority of scholars either set a non-zero minimum value even on poor non-Muslims or leave it to the Muslim authorities to decide for themselves. This in itself makes jizya discriminatory on poor non-Muslims. But of course, there's also the issue of the purpose of jizya, what it represents and how it is to be collected. And here there's a range of opinions. To their credit, a lot of Muslim scholars emphasize the importance of leniency and gentleness when collecting this tax from non-Muslims. For example, Imam Nawawi, the famous jurist of the Shafi'i school, strongly objected to the harsh and humiliating manner in which Muslim scholars of Khorasan used to collect jizya from non-Muslims. And Imam Ibn Qudama also encouraged kindness and gentleness when collecting jizya. But of course, they're only objecting to this type of humiliation because other scholars of Islam explicitly emphasize that this is how it is supposed to be collected. In fact, Imam Malik, who's the founder of one of the four main schools of Islamic law for Sunnis, explicitly declares that the purpose of jizya is to humiliate the non-Muslims. He says this in his Muwatta. Zakat is imposed on the Muslims to purify them and to be given back to their poor, whereas jizya is imposed on the people of the book to humble them. Now the English translation here uses the word humble, but if you see the actual Arabic on the side, you can see that it uses the word saghar al-lahum. The literal meaning of this is to make something small. So in the context of applying it to other humans, it means to belittle them or humiliate them, which is a more accurate translation. So one of the founders of the four madhabs of Sunni Islam is explicitly stating that the essential purpose of jizya is to humiliate the Jews and Christians who are required to pay it. Next, we have the teachings of Imam Abu Hanifa and the Hanafi school of Islamic law. As I mentioned earlier, the book Al-Hidayah of Imam Marqinani is the foremost source of Hanafi jurisprudence. In the second volume of this book, page 403, in the section of jizya, we read, Imam Abu Hanifa says that it, i.e. the jizya, has been imposed as a penalty on the dhimmis for insisting and remaining unbelievers, as we have explained. It is for this reason that it is not accepted from a dhimmi if he sends it through his deputy, according to the most authentic narration. Rather, he is required to come in person and pay it while standing, while the one collecting the jizya from him is seated. In another narration, it is mentioned that he takes him, that is the dhimmi, by the collar and shakes him, saying, "Give the jizya, O dhimmi." So it is established that it, that is the jizya, is a punishment, and punishments when combined overlap like the hudud punishment. So the founder of the Hanafi school of Islam has also stated that the jizya is not just a simple tax, it is a punishment on non-Muslims for not accepting Islam, and it has to be paid by the non-Muslims in a submissive way. Let's take a look at some more examples of this by other famous Islamic scholars as well. Imam Ibn Kathir, who's a renowned Shafi scholar and is the author of one of the most famous and important exegeses of the Quran, explains verse number 29 of Surah 9 in this way. The verse reads, "Fight against those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and His Messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who were given the scripture. Fight until they give the jizya willingly while they are humbled." Paying jizya is a sign of kufr and disgrace. Allah said, until they pay the jizya, if they do not choose to embrace Islam, with willing submission, in defeat and subservience, and feel themselves subdued, disgraced, humiliated, and belittled. Therefore, Muslims are not allowed to honor the people of the Dhimma, that is the Jews or Christians, or elevate them above Muslims, for they are miserable, disgraced, and humiliated. Muslim recorded from Abu Huraira that the Prophet said, "Do not initiate the salam to the Jews and Christians, and if you meet any of them in a road, force them to its narrowest alley." This is why the leader of the faithful, Umar bin al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, demanded his well-known conditions be met by the Christians, these conditions that ensure their continued humiliation, degradation, and disgrace. This is what Ibn Kathir says about the nature of jizya, and this has all been translated into English as you can see in these screenshots. You can read this tafsir for yourself. It's completely free and available online. Just search for the English tafsir of Ibn Kathir and you'll find it. Next, we have Fath al-Qadir, the tafsir of the famous Salafi scholar Imam al-Shawkani. He writes about this verse of the Quran, and they are humiliated in the accusative sense. And the word saghar here means humiliation. By the way, this is what I mentioned earlier too, that the more accurate translation of the word saghar isn't humble, it's humiliated. Continuing, this means that the dhimmi pays the jizya while he is humiliated. It is said that it means that he brings it himself in person, walking, not riding, and he hands it over while standing, and the one receiving it is sitting. And finally, we also have the tafsir of Imam Zamakhshari, who is a famous Mu'tazilite scholar, so practically on the complete opposite end of the theological spectrum from Imam Shawkani, who I just quoted. And he says the same thing in his tafsir of the verse. They have a great blessing upon them, though they are humiliated. That is, the jizya is taken from them while they are humiliated and lowly. The non-Muslim shall come by himself in person, walking, not riding, and when he pays, he shall be standing, while the tax collector will be seated. And the tax collector shall grab him by the neck and shake him and say, "Pay the jizya." And when he pays it, he shall be slapped on the back of his neck. Yeah, this Imam Zamakhshari wasn't pulling any punches here. Okay, so even though theologically Imam Shawkani and Zamakhshari could not be further apart from each other, they both insist that the jizya is a form of humiliation for the non-Muslims and that this tax should be collected from them while they are humiliated and lowly. So when Hijab asks, in what sense is it discriminatory? Then this is that sense. Muslim scholars from across the religious spectrum have insisted that this tax is an expression of authority of Muslims over non-Muslims and that it is a form of humiliation on the non-Muslims. Hijab, of course, chooses to live in a Western non-Muslim country which has secular liberal values, where such discriminatory practices are forbidden by law. If today England instituted two different tax systems, one for Christians and one for everyone else, where Muslims were required to submit to the same rules and practices that the dhimmis had to submit to when paying the jizya, then you can imagine how bitterly and ceaselessly he would complain about discrimination and Islamophobia from the government. And rightfully so, that would indeed be discrimination. But when it comes to these same practices being applied to non-Muslims by Muslims, Hijab doesn't hesitate to defend them. And this is why Islam is completely incompatible with the modern liberal world, since Islamic law essentially and explicitly privileges Muslims over non-Muslims. Hijab, of course, continues to defend this discrimination in the next section of this video, and in the next part of this series, I will respond to his claims where he's arguing that this discrimination against non-Muslims is justified.